We learned in class that Alexander the Great was one of a kind. He was born to a powerful king and queen, raised to lead armies, taught to believe himself the son of a god, instructed by Aristotle, and was capable of acts of strategy and cruelty that would build him the greatest empire of his time. There's no one else like him in all of history. Despite all of this, Alexander did not view himself as unique and above all others, at least when it came to his companion and closest friend Hephaestion. There is a story about the pair, recorded by the Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus, that describes a time when Hephaestion was mistakenly believed by a subject to be Alexander. After being corrected by a member of Alexander's entourage, the subject began to apologize, thinking she had insulted the king. Alexander calmly dismissed her apologies and exclaimed that she had not been incorrect, for Hephaestion was, and I quote, also Alexander. From this we can see that there is no doubt that Alexander shared a deep, meaningful relationship with his companion Hephaestion. After all, they had grown up together and fought side by side in battle. Once king, Alexander made Hephaestion a general in his army, implying that he had great amounts of trust in Hephaestion's loyalty and abilities. Quintus also described Hephaestion as the dearest to the king of all his friends and the confidant of all his secrets. Countless other scholars and historians, both ancient and modern, have commented on the strength of their bond. Throughout my research, I found no one questioning the existence of an intimate relationship between the two. The question instead lies in exactly what kind of intimacy the pair shared: platonic, sexual, or romantic. Scholars do not agree on this point. Some say Alexander and Hephaestion were nothing more than close friends, while others argue that it is likely the pair were romantically and sexually involved. After reviewing the available evidence, I have concluded that Alexander and Hephaestion were lovers. By defining the ancient Greek concepts of platonic and sexual love and comparing them to Alexander and Hephaestion's relationship, we will clearly see that it was entirely possible for them to be sexually and romantically involved. Furthermore, an examination of homosexual culture in Macedonia, Alexander's grief at Hephaestion's passing, and Achilles and Patroclus' relationship will prove that something more than a friendly bond existed between the two. Before we can analyze the specifics of Alexander and Hephaestion's relationship, we must first define what platonic and sexual relationships looked like in ancient Greece, as they are very different from how we imagine them today. We will start by examining what friendship, or platonic love, meant to the people of the time. The philosopher Aristotle outlined his definition of friendship in his collections of writings, which you can see here. Since Aristotle taught Alexander, it is important to consider how his views on friendship might have shaped or influenced Alexander's interpretation of the concept. Aristotle examines many different types of friendships, but overall comes to the conclusion that, and I quote, "the perfect kind of friendship is that of good men who resemble one another in virtue." Aristotle clearly holds this ideal of friendship in high esteem, and it is likely that Aristotle might have done so also. Conveniently, Aristotle lists some criteria which must be met in order for a pair to be considered perfect friends. He says a perfect friendship must last a considerable amount of time, that both parties must be worthy of love and trust each other, and that much time should be spent with each other. Alexander and Hephaestion meet all of this criteria. They knew each other for most of their lives, were clearly men of great worth and importance, obviously trusted each other, and, as could be expected, spent a great deal of time together. If we don't look at any other factors, we could take this information and comfortably conclude that the pair were no more than good friends. However, we would be doing a disservice to Alexander and Hephaestion if we did not consider all the possibilities. Next, we must define what gay relationships looked like in ancient Greece. Modern scholars use various models to describe homosexual relationships during the time. The most commonly referred to and most controversial model is the Dover model. The Dover model was created by scholar K.J. Dover in 1978. It claims that the only socially acceptable sexual relationship between two men involved a young man and an older gentleman with a higher social standing. The young man was called the eromenos and was the receiver of sexual acts. The older man was called the erastes and was responsible for initiating or seeking out the relationship. The older man, or the erastes, was the only one who should have gained any pleasure from the relationship. The younger man, or the eromenos, was expected to partake in sexual activities with the erastes, not out of attraction or desire, but out of pity or a sense of duty. In other words, one half of the people in the relationship would have rather the relationship not existed at all. Furthermore, if these roles were switched or if they didn't exist at all, Dover believed the relationship would be considered unacceptable in their society. However, a few problems exist in this model. Dover focused almost entirely on homosexual relationships in Athens, which completely ignores much of the culture Alexander and Hephaestion were influenced by. There are also not many primary sources which describe exactly what homosexual relationships look like in the ancient world. Because of this lack of evidence and his hyper-focus on Athens, I believe the Dover model too confidently assumes that the dynamic between gay men in ancient Greece was unbalanced and unpleasurable. James Davidson, author of an article published in the Oxford University Press about this very subject, agrees with me. He argues that the picture of ancient sex and sexual morality as a plus-minus zero-sum game where only one party can win at the expense of the other is not only unsubstantiated but contradicts what evidence there is. If we only consider the Dover model, Alexander and Hephaestion were not lovers. After all, an age gap was necessary for a couple to truly be one of an Eromenos and an Erastes. Alexander and Hephaestion were peers without a large age gap, meaning they could not completely fit the criteria set by the Dover model. A power imbalance, such as that existing between a king and his general, could substitute an age gap, but as we have already seen, Alexander viewed himself and Hephaestion as equals. All this being said, Dover would have said that they were not lovers. However, there are other models to consider. While gay relationships in Macedonia, where Alexander and Hephaestion originated, mostly followed the Dover model, some did not. There are quite a few documented examples of homosexual pairs in Alexander's court. One specific pair of lovers is especially intriguing, as both were the same age, yet one was specifically called the Erastes. The historians which documented the existence of this couple had nothing to say about the possible irregularity of their relationship, implying that it was socially acceptable for two men of the same age to have sexual relations and identify as an Eromenos and an Erastes. Furthermore, homosexual relationships in Macedonia seem to have been more socially acceptable and relaxed than those in Athens. They were acceptable and abundant both in the royal court and in the military, both of which Alexander and Hephaestion were part of. Furthermore, homosexual relationships were often encouraged in military settings there because it was believed that a man would fight more passionately for someone if they were in love. Therefore, Alexander and Hephaestion would not have felt social pressure to deprive themselves of a sexual relationship if they had wanted one with each other. In other words, it is completely possible in their context that they could have had a sexual relationship. We've now defined platonic and sexual relationships in the ancient world and proven that Alexander and Hephaestion could plausibly have had either one. Why then am I so confident that their relationship was more than platonic? If we take a closer look at a few specifics of their relationships, I'm sure you will see why. The first thing we will consider is Alexander's grief at Hephaestion's death. While few of their interactions in life are recorded, there are numerous documents describing Alexander's reaction to Hephaestion's death, namely because it was so extreme. Though ancient historians differ on exactly how Alexander reacted, they agree that he was completely devastated by his companion's death. Some historians claim he sobbed over Hephaestion's body for an entire day until he was forcibly dragged from it, others that he cut off his hair as a sign of respect, and others still that he ate nothing for 3 days after he learned of Hephaestion's death. He then arranged for an expensive funeral for Hephaestion and even tried to treat his death as the death of a god, but was not allowed to do so. Alexander's living allies tried to get in his good favor by competing to see who could mourn for Hephaestion more. All of this shows Alexander's extreme love for Hephaestion. Even so, this kind of extreme grief was not uncommon. Men of the time often reacted to the death of a loved one in extreme ways. For example, after learning of his son Hector's death, the ancient king Priam covered himself in feces. Another example is that of Achilles and Patroclus. After learning about Patroclus's death, Achilles tore out his hair and began physically harming himself, as well as grieving over his late companion's body and refusing to leave it. These examples show both how fathers, like Priam, and lovers, like Achilles, grieve for their lost loved ones. As Alexander was certainly not Hephaestion's father, we can see that his way of grieving clearly aligns with how a lover would react to their partner's death in the ancient world. You may have noticed that I confidently called Achilles and Patroclus lovers during my previous point. Most modern and ancient scholars agree that the pair were most likely sexually and romantic involved during their lifetime. Their relationship is relevant because of Alexander's obsession with Achilles, which we covered in class. We learned that Alexander completely idolized Achilles and wanted to mirror him in every way. Therefore, I believe it is entirely possible that Alexander viewed his relationship with Hephaestion as identical to that of Achilles and Patroclus. Evidence supports this theory. For example, Quintus describes how, during a visit to Achilles and Patroclus' grave sites, Alexander placed a wreath on Achilles' grave while Hephaestion placed one on Patroclus's. Quintus explicitly states that this shows that Hephaestion held the same place in the friendship of Alexander that Patroclus did in that of Achilles. Quintus goes on to say that Alexander believed that Achilles' happiness was due in part to his relationship with his companion. This event shows how Alexander himself viewed his relationship with Hephaestion, and is the most compelling argument for the existence of a homosexual relationship between them. Alexander would have been totally aware of the probable existence of a sexual relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. He would have also been aware that having Hephaestion honor the grave of Patroclus while he honored that of Achilles would have served as a practical announcement of their relationship to everyone who heard about it. In the end, we have seen that not only is it entirely possible that Alexander and Hephaestion were more than just good friends, but that it was very likely that they shared a sexual and romantic relationship. For example, the flourishing gay community in Macedonia proves that relationships between two men of the same age and status could and did exist, as well as that gay relationships were common and sometimes encouraged in the social circles Alexander and Hephaestion existed in. Furthermore, Alexander's grief at Hephaestion's death was very similar to the grief a lover might have shown over the death of their significant other, proving that their feelings for one another were more than strong enough to support a sexual and romantic relationship. Finally, Alexander and Hephaestion's purposefully made connection with Achilles and Patroclus shows that they identified with a homosexual couple. Even the arguments that could be made against the idea that they were not lovers are flimsy at best. The Dover model, as we have previously discussed, is not particularly reliable, and even Aristotle's definition of friendship is not particularly harmful to my argument, as Aristotle himself argued that different kinds of love, including romantic and platonic love, could be present in one relationship. Overall, it is evident that Alexander and Hephaestion were romantically and sexually involved during their lifetimes. Here are my sources, and here are my image sources. Thank you very much.